this was an international competition for the museum. It is the first time Quebec does an international competition for a museum and a public museum. And of course, OMA do a lot of competition, but I wondered why you applied for this specific international competition in Canada, and very specifically in Quebec City.
We are always interested in cultural specificity, and of course we knew Canada as a whole, but we were always interested in even more special places like Quebec, which has of course French-speaking culture and very different from the rest of Canada. I mean, that's one simple reason that we thought it was first interesting. Second, any strong cultural institution like you obviously attracted us, but also, you know, art is becoming very globalized too, and your institution also has, again, a specific aim to communicate the Quebec art, as well as the kind of, you know, art in general. So I guess those specificities attracted us.
So this was a two-phase competition, and you were selected, of course, at the first phase, which was a selection on CV, and the second phase was about presenting a concept. And at that occasion, I think you came over to Quebec, and I was wondering what inspired you, both in the program and in visiting the city, in order to produce the concept you were selected for at the second phase.
What was very clear when we arrived here is that in an urban scale, there was a series of like dichotomies, like nature and the city, the park and the city, and also old and new. So we thought that this project actually represents not only the issue that is there for the museum, but it somehow represents the issue of the entire city. So we thought it was a very interesting ambition that you were having by, you know, represented by the extension of the museum.
So let's talk about the context of this extension, because one of the characteristics of the museum is it is really into a large park that is sitting a little bit on the border of the inner city. And the museum had no entrance on the street, and the purpose of the pavilion was not only to, of course, display Quebec art in a beautiful and, of course, very prestigious pavilion, but also to make a bridge between the existing building and the city. And I think this was for you, when you studied the site and you produced the concept, something that inspired you.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't truly inspiring at that moment. It was more of a problem, we thought.
Issue.
There was, although you have such a long interface between the park and the city, we couldn't find a really pleasant way to enter from the city to the park, in which we thought it was very strange given the proportion of the park that faces the city. So we thought, you know, we could easily understood the intention that you have, that museum becomes the entrance to the park, and we define the interface to the city. And I thought that was, you know, more of an identification of a problem rather than inspiration. But of course, the museum in the park, there are many museums in the park, but we, of course, like the kind of challenge of the museum in the park becoming a museum also for the city. And I think, again, that really represents the general issue that Quebec City had, we thought.
And of course, one of the characteristics of this context is that we have juxtaposition with church and presbytery very close to it. How did you react to that fact that this fourth pavilion will not only be, of course, opening up on the street and linking the 3 other pavilions that are in the park, but also really next and integrating religious building like the presbytery that is really part of the site, and next to it the church?
It was actually overwhelmingly rich, the context.
Yeah, I love it.
Because we had to connect to existing complex, we had to be aware of the continuity to the park, we had to be aware of the frontage to the city, we had to also respect the religious building next door. I guess it was part of the rich context, but as you know, we also do a lot of preservation projects.
I know.
Or nowadays in the city, also in North America, I mean in Europe it's very common, but when you build something new, automatically you're dealing with the old structure and preservation. It was difficult to imagine how the new museum that is imagined as a new face is also next to a very old church. But I mean, of course, that was a kind of interesting nature of this project too. So it was challenging, but also very rewarding for us to react.
Yeah. So let's talk about this initial concept you presented for the competition and how you ended up with that concept and what are the features of that concept.
Yeah. Of course, whenever we present this project, we present as if this concept came very naturally or from day one. But we had, of course, extensive research and study. But I think always those issues of how this building can be a nexus to between the landscape, between the park and the city, and how art can be more than just an art that people, a museum that people just visit, but the art becoming a catalyst to the activity and also the nature. And I think those vague dichotomy were always present in all the studies. But I think the studies were, of course, very crucial for us to come to the final conviction. And I really remember, it's a very strange moment, and I told you many times that it's very rare that I personally feel that this concept is very strong and natural to the givens. You're always a bit worried, is this right or is this wrong? But at that moment, we felt very natural and content. Oh, this is the only way almost when we found the concept. So that was a magical moment in my kind of architect's life.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I must say, for myself, becoming after the competition executive director, this was really my spontaneous choice, your concept. And I think you read the program in a very respectful manner, but you really push it forward. And this is for me what architecture is doing, is really giving more to what you described in words in the program.
It was a kind of moment that is really iconic museum trend. It was ending, and when we first came and when we looked at the program and the rich context of, next to a religious building and so on, we felt that by just by really truly expressing the richness of the context, like, okay, we have to respect the height, we have to have a continuity to the park, we have to really show the program, the gallery spaces that you wanted. Those things will be enough to create an, natural, but in a way iconic place, not iconic architecture per se, but iconic place that creates a strong gesture. So we weren't really preoccupied by the form. We were very preoccupied by the expressing the kind of complexity of the site. Or we thought that by expressing the complexity of the site, you actually get quite an iconic architecture. But we thought that, again, it was, we didn't want to make it just for a museum or just for the art, because we knew that museum has been becoming more of a public space.
Of course.
Because, you know, museum has been incorporating a lot of educational program, event program, etc. in the world. So museum is not just where you observe art. So in that regards, we thought that maybe museum, just extending the museum sounds like, okay, a museum acquiring a site, but because we immediately realized the kind of tension or the possibility or a dialogue between the park and the city, we thought it would be a beautiful idea that everyone can extend, not just a museum. So when we were thinking, how can everyone extend, we thought, oh, maybe just peeling off the ground and the park, so that the park can, you know, basically continue.
On the roofs.
And then the city can actually come under, and art becoming a mediator of both would be a beautiful concept. We thought it was almost like a campus planning or urban planning. And in order to do that, we had to really look at the collections you have, and also basically the ingredients of the urbanism, the collection you had, art collection you had, the activities you were doing, and also a diversity of the spaces you already had in existing building. You know, the museum tend to, because of the control of light for the art, museum tend to be, of course, a little bit fortress-like, that the walls are often solid, and you get a natural light, controlled light from above. That's the kind of typology that are growing nowadays. We thought maybe rather than that as a starting point, we maybe thought that it's actually a completely open and translucent or transparent box that actually start to have walls. So it's of course the end result might be similar, but in our mind, we thought it was actually interesting to reverse the construct of the gallery box, that first a translucent box and then walls to display. Also, of course, we thought it was very interesting that because of the shape that are stacked boxes, you can actually get lights from many directions, like from below or from above or from sides.
And one of the things you did along the design process as well is to adapt for the connection between the pavillon Lassonde with the other pavilion, and in order to also accommodate the masterpiece of the museum. So could you talk about that too?
Yeah. In terms of connection, I would like to say that there is also literal connection, which is a tunnel in the Leopold Gallery, but there is also visual connections that we were very much cared. For example, by when you're climbing the stair, when you're circulating, when you're standing in the gallery, as you know, we made a couple of windows that frames clearly the feature of the context.
Exactly.
And we thought that the visual connection was also very, very important to unite the campus. But I think we are very, very happy that what tend to be a secondary space like connection became basically one of the most important space for the museum, which is representing the Quebec art, Leopold's
Rosa Luxembourg masterpiece,
masterpiece as a connection. That's I think that's a very, very courageous decision on your side, but also I think it's actually quite rewarding space.
So also I think in this building, the structure itself has a specific language and meaning. And you did a lot of research for the envelope, and the structure and the envelope has a very specific relationship as well. So I'd like to hear you on the structure of the building.
I think the structure, as you said, is almost like a bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah, literal bridge to make that gesture happen. I think that's an interesting thing about how our very crude concept diagram actually start to define certain architectural move and features to the detail level, because in order to really show that the city is coming in and the park is continuing above, we really wanted to keep the building very pure in terms of that relationship, so that we didn't want to have too many obstructions for the city to come in. We wanted to make the kind of topography of the box very pure. So, you know, that's the reason why the structure is performing so straightforward way to keep the cantilever as well. The cantilever allows that gesture to be very clear. We made this space for the city. We call it a kind of grand hall, and we are calling that becomes a living room for the city. So we almost started to think, oh, maybe we said this is a city, but it's actually a public space, almost like a plaza, where you can, you know, do so many civic events. And well, I'm also personally surprised how diverse this building is, although it looks very simple.
From outside.
Yeah, it looks very simple from outside, but when you're inside, because, of course, of the rich context around, it creates like a courtyard space or the intersection to the presbytery. Those spaces are, of course, very rich because of the existing structure. But even inside, you know, we wanted to create a very clear circulation space and a signage spaces where to keep the gallery very pure, and you know, the experience between the circulation and gallery spaces becomes like integrated as much as possible.
Yeah. And you had also this core circulation, vertical circulation with this very large vertical volume that is in a way like a spine of the whole 3 volumes altogether.
Well, the core, the elevator is become, of course, it's a very important part of the museum, partially because of the freight capability. You have to move very comfortably the artwork. So, of course, it's a central piece. I think the windows really contribute to enjoy the context, not just art, and enjoy the buildings around the other, you know, buildings in the campus. Also, the visual connections reinforces the idea that this building is part of a larger network, and also it's within the landscape. And I think, you know, when the museum experience tend to be, again, very closed, but I think windows almost creates this kind of moments that people are drawn into with the natural light coming in. So I think it's a kind of very right amount and right locations to enjoy the context, but also to be exposed to the natural light once in a while during the museum experience.
Let's talk maybe of museum more in general. You started, of course, linking and thinking about that functions of a museum, how you design a museum. And of course, you, OMA, designed several spaces recently, the Prada Foundation. and the garage extension in St. Petersburg. So how do you see this new pavilion in terms of contribution to museum architecture, and what you think about what is happening in that field, in that function for architecture?
For me, this museum represents much larger spectrum of art. Also, you know, it's a very specific aim to not just communicate the Quebec art, but also to bring international art into the space and to introduce to people in Quebec. So I think it has much more kind of civic nature to it, and also the fact that it's in the park, the fact that it's over time, it has so many different era within a single complex. It for me has a completely different dimension. The museum is becoming more of a public domain, not just consuming art. So those, of course, experiences are as important as the gallery spaces. So we think that like the cafe actually really contributes to animate the street. Also, the shop actually really creates interesting dialogue to the grand hall itself, but also to the courtyard, and combining a small library, I think it creates a space that is a little bit more pristine, not too commercial, and something that you can really contemplate about art.
And the last one, what is your greatest satisfaction with the whole process and building and result you saw?
I don't know. I never feel like ultimate satisfaction, but I guess the best one.
The best, of course.
It's a little bit banal, but when the user is happy, of course, I'm very happy. I think when, of course, architecture is a strange business, that you design something without seeing the final result to the very end. So when your conviction or when your assumption of a certain design is proven to be true in reality, of course, that's one of the rewarding. And I will be happy, for example, maybe, I don't know how many years later, but if someone who saw this museum is inspired to make an art or architecture or even politics or whatever, but somehow that if this building could inspire a new round of creativity in the city or to the world, then I would also be very happy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.